Welcome to Shadows of Arklay, the origins of a Madhouse, a 4-part deep dive into the forgotten and shadowy origins of one of Resident Evil's most infamous locations. This series uncovers the Arklay Mansion's true purpose, not just a summer home for Umbrella's elite, but a secret stronghold for twisted eugenics experiments and genetic manipulation long before S.T.A.R.S ever set foot there. More than what the games reveal, the Arklay Mansion holds layers of secrets and lore far beyond anything the games give you. Buried truths uncovered here through careful examination of the established canon, files and real-world sources, strung together with a dash of creative license to tell the story of the most twisted house in the Resident Evil universe. In the last episode, we covered the Tyrant project in full, from its earliest failures to its first success, from Beta 2 to Delta, and finally the Prototype Tyrant, T-001. We followed Birkin and Wesker as they chased a decade-long obsession to its conclusion, and we saw the night the impossible finally breathed behind the glass. December 1987, the unveiling, and a promise made to a room full of Umbrella's elite, a reproduction model, stable and reproducible, ready by the middle of 1998. In this episode, we find out what that promise cost. We cover the finality of the Tyrant project, the making of T-002, the ultimate bioweapon, and the 220 days that turned Umbrella's crown jewel into a tomb. From the first drop of the leak to the last lucid soul left alive. How does the most advanced laboratory in Umbrella's empire fall so completely? How does a house full of people become a house full of monsters? And who is left standing when the countdown finally reaches 0? Let's find out. Part 1. The Real Thing. 220 days to X Day, 14th of December 1997. After seeing the Prototype Tyrant, the executives went home changed. Every one of them had walked in a skeptic and walked out a believer. Not that it would make them rich, though it would, but that it was real, the impossible breathing behind glass. It was believed the Hunter was going to change the world, but this was something else. For the Umbrella people in that room, visitors who'd spent years in labs of their own elsewhere in the company, who thought they'd seen everything Umbrella could grow. Even some of them felt it. Fear. This was beyond the wild, half-mad things they were used to. This one had looked back at them and understood. A few couldn't sleep for weeks afterwards and never quite looked at another person the same way again. For the government men Umbrella had flown in, the ones who didn't work for the company but mattered all the same, it was closer to a dream. A weapon that could win them any war they chose to start and never cost them a life of their own. You could watch it settle on their faces as they worked through the uses. But not everyone in that hall belonged there. Among all the cleared and vetted were a couple who were neither, planted quietly by rival outfits, who'd have given a fortune to know what Umbrella kept behind that glass. For them, the night brought a colder feeling, the realization of just how far behind they truly were. And for one of them in particular, a woman, it brought a decision. She would not be flying home with the others. She needed to stay and find out more. There was something new in those government men that night though. For the first time in a long while, Washington wasn't only interested in the product, they were interested in the man who built it. The hushed conversations kept circling back to one name. William Birkin. They'd worked out where the magic came from, and they couldn't take their eyes off him. For a man who'd spent his entire life in Marcus's shadow, then Spencer's, that was a new feeling. That interest went nowhere that night. But a government that has noticed a man does not simply forget him, and this thread would be pulled again, years later, by other hands and for a different prize entirely. But not here, and not in this story. As for the T-001 itself, it had already done its job. It proved the concept, it proved the strain, but to William it was an unwanted child now, and he had no further use for it. Birkin had stopped thinking about it weeks ago. He was thinking about the next one. The morning after, the guests were gone and the mansion had fallen quiet again. Down in the incubation lab, a cold, humming room built around a single empty cultivation tank. 10 feet of reinforced glass and pale green fluid waiting for an occupant. The two men who rang the place stood beneath it, already past the thing they'd just condemned. "Those men from Washington barely left your side last night," John said. "Spent the whole evening at your elbow. Were they trying to take you away from Umbrella?" "Oh, they'd take me tomorrow if they could," Birkin said. "The government take what they want, John. Land, oil, a tyrant, a man. The only reason they haven't simply helped themselves to the lot of us is that they still need us, or so Spencer keeps telling me. Not that it matters. I'm not going anywhere. I've far too much work left to do with Umbrella." "What else have you got on, William?" John asked. "Tyrant aside, you've never told me you were working on anything." Birkin only smiled. John had been with the Tyrant project since that first meeting back in '88 and ran the whole site now, and still he had no idea about Golgotha. Birkin intended to keep it that way. "Forget I said anything," he said. "We've more pressing matters. I want that prototype out of my lab before we begin TO2. And so the order went out that same day. The prototype was packed up and shipped quietly off to the training school, out of the forest, off-site, out from under the production work, filled under dispose of later. Someone else's problem now. Only later never came. That disposal order was never carried out. The prototype would still be sitting out there in the dark, intact, when a reckoning of an entirely different kind came for the training school that summer. But that is a story for another night. The stage was clear. That evening, a fresh Sergei clone was drawn out of cryo storage. One more perfect match for the profile they'd hunted for a decade, and left under the lights to thaw, the Epsilon virus racked beside it. Everything the prototype had taught them, ready to be folded back in. "You start tomorrow morning, John," Birkin said. "I have other business to see to." He didn't say where. He never did. And as far as John knew, as far as anyone at Arklay knew, there was no laboratory hidden beneath Raccoon City, no nest, no Golgotha. There it was again, the Tyrant, the crowning work of his life, handed off like paperwork, while its maker's mind was already somewhere else entirely, on the virus he actually loved. So it fell to John. And it would not be quick, like the prototype before it. The production model would take months. The Epsilon strain administered early, the body sealed in the tank to incubate under tightly controlled conditions. And then, as the growth took hold, surgery after surgery to reinforce the heart, the nervous system, the frame, all braced to survive what it was becoming. Come the morning, with the host thawing in its cradle, that work would begin. The patient, surgical business of turning one impossible prototype into a weapon you could control, the production model, the ultimate bioweapon, TO02. Part 2. The production model. 180 days to X-Day, the 23rd of January, 1998. To build a heart that should not exist, you first need someone who has spent a career inside the ordinary kind. Arklay had brilliant people. It did not have her. When the prototype's body had begun to outpace its own circulation, straining against a heart that was never built for what it was becoming, the resident team had quietly reached beyond their own walls for help. A consultant cardiovascular surgeon, one of the best money could discreetly buy. She had spent the better part of a year studying the prototype the only way Umbrella would permit, at a distance. Reports, blood panels, scans of a heart she was never once allowed to see in the flesh. Her name was Dr. Helena Reston. For the prototype, she had been a voice on a secure line and a name on a distribution list. For the production model, they wanted her hands. So that winter, Umbrella flew her in. Past the gates, down through the lab levels, set her for the first time in front of the thing she had spent a year advising on from 1,000 miles away. She came for the most extraordinary case of a long career, and she brought 2 assistants with her own people, the only hands she trusted near her heart. 3 foreign names added to the visitor log that winter. On the morning, she stood beneath the cultivation tank. There was only the work, and the work was the heart. She, of all people, understood the problem. A body driven that hard, growing that fast, asks for more of a heart than any single heart can give, and the production model was meant to go further than the prototype in every direction. Bigger, stronger, faster, so the problem would not shrink, it would grow with everything else. The answer the team had reached, and the reason they had finally brought her in, was simple. To stay and obscene to attempt. Don't give it one heart, give it two. None of it existed yet. What waited behind the glass that spring was not a tyrant, but a becoming, a body assembling itself cell by cell in a pod of pale solution. Lifted out for each surgery, lowered back to grow on, incubate, operate, return again and again across the spring. Everything they spoke of in the future tense. The claws the prototype had grown, they expected this one to grow longer and harder, the hide thicker, the frame heavier. They were aiming on paper for something near 8.5 feet tall and a quarter of a ton, every pound of it reinforced. It was a promise written into a body that had not finished writing itself. And somewhere in that promise, two hearts. One where a heart belongs, and the second, if it came as they intended, too large for the cavity that should have held it, designed to sit where nothing alive keeps a heart, outside, on the surface of the chest. Reston's task across those months was to brace a circulatory system for an organ that did not exist yet. She thought it was the most beautiful and the most obscene thing she had ever been asked to do. She knew the danger better than anyone in the building. A heart surgeon knows what it costs to keep a thing alive through violence, and the violence here had a name. Epsilon. The Epsilon strain, the engine under all its growth, with what the files call the epochal property to instantly evolve a creature it assimilates. Not infect, but evolve. Of the 4 base subjects taken into the program, 3 had not survived the change. In a sense, that was her whole purpose. She was the answer to those 3 deaths. She was not the only answer Umbrella had brought that winter. The place they had flown her into was not a laboratory, it was a factory, and it was running flat out. Down one corridor her own work, the one perfect weapon grown, a single painstaking subject at a time. Down another, something else entirely. The Hunter program had last stood at MA-118, close but not finished. Now, at last, it was the MA-121, Hunter Alpha. And with it the thing the lab had chased since the 80s, a bioweapon Umbrella could mass produce by cloning, turned out not one at a time, but in batches, at a price the board adored. And a third team again bent over a proposal that had reached Arklay that very spring. The next flagship, a thing called TO-11, that the board had already seen. The Tyrant Reston was perfecting was, to some of them, already the old project. That proposal never got its team. Birkin read it and put it back in the drawer. One impossible thing at a time, he said, and the site had its hands full, making the last one work. TO-11 never quite got going. It did not die on the page, though. The site managed to make a single embryo and got it out before the spring was over, but the program never gathered pace beyond that, and the people hired against it that winter would spend the spring doing other work entirely. There were not many women in the building, and fewer still who stayed, so when Reston kept crossing paths with the same one, short dark hair, the only Asian woman on the staff, always somewhere she had a good reason to be and never quite where you remembered her afterwards, she did the ordinary human thing. She said hello, and then one evening, over bad coffee in the empty rec room, she sat down across from her. "Keep seeing you everywhere, and I still don't know what you do," Reston said. "Which lab are you?" "I move around, wherever they need an extra pair of hands." A small smile. "Mostly, I'm just here for John." "John Clements?" "He runs the whole place." "I'm his assistant," the woman said. "I came with him." It was Reston who should have been the stranger here, flown in weeks ago, cleared to a handful of rooms, known almost to no one. But the young woman across the table knew her, knew where she'd trained, knew about the prototype she'd consulted on, the one nobody outside a sealed list was supposed to know existed, knew the heart she'd been brought in to build, and asked after it the way a colleague would, warm, precise, genuinely interested. Reston put it down to John. They were close, they ran the site, he must have mentioned her. And he had, though he'd never known to whom. She was not one to sit and wait. The May operation had to be built toward, and it could not be moved, so Reston spent her evenings on requisitions and schedules. That was how she came to say the rest of it out loud. "It must be almost finished then," the woman said. "You're part of it." "Nearly," Reston said. "One surgery left." "The big one, the one that finishes the hearts." He has two. "When?" "May. It has to be May. The body decides, not me. It comes ready when it's ready, and we get the one chance to take it. So no, I'm not sitting idle. I have a theatre to build." And for half a heartbeat, something moved behind the young woman's eyes. Not warmth, but something colder, there and gone before it could be named. "Then I hope it goes perfectly." She smiled, and she meant it, though not in the way Reston heard it. Reston smiled back and told herself she'd imagined the rest. She thought nothing more of the woman. Nobody ever did. 2 production lines ran at once now, the Tyrant and the Hunters, where a year before there had been 1. The mansion had never been busier. It had never been fuller either. So the spring of 1998 passed, and it passed to plan. The body in the tank grew towards its promise, a little more finished each time. Reston's work went well. The place had never been more certain of itself. One operation remained, the last and the most delicate. The one that would finish the heart, and with it the dream. It was set for a morning in May. Reston would be at the table for it, on paper, no different from the dozens that had come before. It was the operation that would finish everything they had built. It was the one that would end everything that they had. Part 3. The House Full of People. "100 days to X-Day, 13th of April 1998. 44 people worked and slept and ate inside the Arklay compound in the spring of 1998. A year before, you could have counted the staff on your fingers. The lab had been running lean. Then the prototype proved out, T002 was green lit, and a production line needs filling. They came all that winter and spring, the heliport never quiet, the ecliptic express running thick with new faces through the forest. Surgeons, cryotechnicians, virologists, splicing teams, security, all arranged by Paul Freshwater. "Sign here, take your course of antiretrovirals and off you go." The antibody therapy a formality, he'd say, the standard course anyone on a live viral site was meant to finish. Not all of them did. By March, he'd filled the place. By April, past comfortable. John Clemens noticed first, because noticing was what John did, the careful one in a building full of reckless geniuses, stickler for procedure in a place that had stopped keeping any. He'd broken exactly one rule of his own: never lose your head inside your own building. That one he'd broken completely. He ran more of the site every week, as Birkin came by less and less. There was no office manager at Arklay to take the rest. By rights, the overflow should have been Scott's, head of security. But Scott had gone off the rails, and the guardroom under him had become a boys' drinking club. So it all came to John. The rooms, the rotas, and a kitchen where Gordon, the head chef, ran himself ragged, feeding a small army of a house built for a handful. By the 13th of April, it had come to a head. That was the morning a junior technician named Hart, cutting from the kitchen to the dining hall, rounded a blind corner into Eddie, the new assistant chef, and his tray of boiling tea, and went to the infirmary scalded, off his workstation, a week. John picked up the telephone in the computer room on the lab's 3rd level, the nearest thing he had to an office, and called the one man who could thin the numbers, William Birkin. "We're over capacity, William, badly. People bunking 3 to a room, a queue out of the dining room at every sitting." And Birkin's attention was somewhere else. "And I've taken on 2 cleaners and assistant chef just to keep the place standing. Half my week goes on cleaning up after Paul. He crammed the place full and left me to house them all. Sign here, ship them in, never mind where they sleep. So delegate. To who? There's no one. That's the point. And then there's the guardhouse." "What about the guardhouse?" "They've made a nightclub of it. 40 exhausted people with nowhere else to go, drinking 1 floor above the aqua ring. One of them's going to end up in that tank with the things we keep in it." Then Birkin, gentler than John had expected. I'll speak to Scott about the guardhouse. Keeping that law and order is his job, not yours, and you're right, John, all of it. But I can't move the last surgery. It has to be May. Hold it together till then, and you'll have every change you've asked for. You've got my word. And that was that. The house held more than a head count. It held people. A few were holdovers. Henry Sarting among his plants, Keith Arving still running the visual data room, Eric and Sebastian still on the books since the night of the unveiling. Most were the ramps. 3 of them are worth remembering. Aaron Vance, the surgeon whose hands would finish what Reston had designed, Cole Mercer, who minded the whole bank of capsule tanks that Tyrant grew among, and Evelyn Crane, hired that winter for TO-11, the program that never quite got going, before she even arrived. When she got there, on the capsule tanks beside Mercer instead, the visitors, Reston and her 2, were by spring just part of the furniture. On the evening of the 24th of April, 3 of them sat over the wreckage of dinner in the main dining room, Owen, Priya and Hugo. 6 weeks since I had a room to myself. 6, Owen said. 11 years of training, and I'm sharing a bunk with a man who talks gene splicing in his sleep. Better than the laboratory on B3, Priya said. They've got us treading on each other down there. You can't run a clean lab like this. Someone is going to make a mistake. Somebody already has. Did you see the paper? He slid it across, a regional rag weeks out of date kept for the crossword, the Daily Raccoon, the 2nd of April. A small item near the foot of the page, an environmental group flagging a steady rise in toxins in the local water, creeping up across the last year or so. Priya read it and laughed under her breath. Source unknown. Well, aren't we glad we don't drink the tap? They laughed and went back to the crossword. It didn't occur to one of them to ask what might be leaking into the stream that ran past a building like this. Hugo had said nothing. When he spoke, it was quieter. First proper batch of MA121's nearly done, stray off the line. How many? Owen said. As many as they want. They're not building them one at a time anymore. A silence at that. Even among the people who built them, the hunters landed a little colder than the rest. Priya set down her pen. Someone ought to tell Scott to ease off while we're counting mistakes waiting to happen. Scott's fine, Owen said. Scott was asleep at his desk at 10 this morning, a bottle in his drawer, head of security, God help us, if anything ever actually happens. Nothing ever happened, so nobody reported him. But they weren't wrong about Scott. Across that last year, he'd quietly become a functional alcoholic, and the men under him covered for it, the way Elias took the morning rounds. Scott slept through and said nothing. The one man who might have caught it wasn't there. Albert Wesker spent that spring away serving as S.T.A.R.S captain in Raccoon City, his face a stranger's to half the people now crowding the halls. So the man whose job was keeping the place secure was quietly losing his grip on it. And in all of it, moving through the crowd, was the woman nobody quite placed, helpful, friendly, the kind who seemed to know everyone and always took an interest. John Clemens, who carried 44 lives and a secret he didn't know the size of, had found in her someone he could finally set the weight down with. Late on the 28th of April, in the small library on the mansion's 2nd floor, its window over the heliport and one of the few quiet corners left, door shut and just the 2 of them. She told him she'd be going away for a while. It's my family, she said. They need me home for a bit. Nothing's wrong, I just can't keep putting them off. How long is a bit? A few weeks? Maybe more? She let that sit. You'll barely notice, the place keeps you busy enough. That's not true and you know it. She smiled and let him believe it had cost her something to say. By the 2nd week of May, the house was as full as it would ever be and holding its breath. One voice survives from that fortnight. Peter Smith, the keeper, fed the specimens and, like half the staff that spring, kept a diary. Evenings out in Raccoon City were discouraged now. That was John's doing, pushed on him by Vernon Corliss, Scott's second-in-command, so people wrote the days down instead. His diary that week is almost unbearably ordinary. The 9th of May, he writes, was a poker night. Steve cleaned them out again. I think he cheats, Peter notes. The 10th, something new in one of his pens. He calls it a skinned gorilla and records without much feeling that it was being given live prey now. Just another thing in a cage at a place where the things in cages were the whole point. An ordinary fortnight in a full house. Because down in the laboratory on B3, behind the clean, cold doors, the theatre was ready. The instruments were laid out. The body had reached, to the day, the precise stage they'd waited all spring for, and the window to take it would not come again. It was set for the morning of the 11th, 5 o'clock in the morning. Reston scribbed in, Vance at the table beside her, the host lifted from its tank for the very last time. John watched from a monitor in the surgeon's room next door, close enough to see, not close enough to be in the way. And in Nest, William Birkin watched the same feed. Everything they had built had come down to the next few hours, and it was just about to begin. Part 4. The Leak. 72 days to X-Day, the 11th of May, 1998. The surgery had been running for 4 hours when the room turned on the people inside it. It had begun at 1 in the morning, timed to finish by dawn. Reston had the chest open, Vance across the table from her, 2 assistants at their shoulders. Then a little after 5, without a sound anyone could point to, the air in the theatre stopped being safe. No one saw how. One of the assistants, Carl Denner, noticed a smear on the arm of his suit. A wet, colourless slime that hadn't been there before. He wiped it off and thought no more of it. The other assistant, Ivor Brandt, caught something moving at the edge of his eye. Low, dark, wet. He looked straight at it. Nothing? Then the alarm went. It filled the theatre. A sealed, viral operating room doesn't suffer a breach in silence. The door was locked, as it always was, once they'd scrubbed in, and 4 exhausted people did the one human thing. They ran for the door. John saw it happen from the monitor next door, and hit the intercom. Stop. Nobody moves. There's a protocol for this. There was, somewhere. Not one of them had ever been told what it was. That was how the place worked. Every task, its own locked box. No one handed a page beyond their own. So they stood in the noise halfway to a door that wouldn't open, waiting for a man on a speaker to tell them what to do. He never got the chance. In Nest, Birkin had the same feed in front of him, and he understood exactly what a breach in that room meant. He cut the theatre intercom dead and took John alone on a private line. John, it's a false alarm. A sensor fault, it's happened before on that line. Tell him to stand down and finish. The board's showing a full airborne containment. I didn't think Epsilon could even go airborne. Exactly, it can't. Which is how I know the board's faulty. I built the room, John, I'd know. Get them back to the table. That surgery finishes today. And John broke his own rule now, because the voice telling him to belong to the man who'd built the virus, the room and everything in it. He keyed the intercom back on. False alarm, stand down, finish. They didn't know the protocol and had no reason to doubt him. They went back to the table and opened the chest again. And the klaxon screamed on. No one in that theatre knew the protocol to silence it, and only a hand at the panel could. So it shrieked out across the lab levels, and every soul down there heard it, and not one had the chance to go and look before security reached them. Birkin put the phone down and made one more call. To Wesker. Wesker made one after that, to the head of the security. Scott took it half asleep and hung over and reached for whatever got him upright most mornings now. No mobile phones in that building, a landline, an order, and a man left alone in the dark to carry it out. Wesker's order came with no reasons. The alarm downstairs was false. Kill it, get them back to work, clear the lab and keep it clear, and when the surgery was done, put its staff in the cell. Suit up. Why any of it? No one said. Scott was never told anything. He suited up, badly, the seal at his collar never quite taking, and went down to the theatre first. The klaxon was still shrieking behind the locked door. Scott let himself in, killed it, and gave the line he'd been given. False alarm, back to the table. He was in the room under a minute. It was enough. The air that had turned on the surgeons found the gap at his collar, and he walked out wearing a dose of it, and never felt a thing. His next order was to clear the lab. No reason with it, and no one asked. The reason was already on its way by air. Birkin, come for the one thing he'd trust to no one, down to B5 to draw off the embryos himself. The embryos would leave the city within the hour. Scott only knew the corridors had to be empty, so he emptied them. Among the ones he moved was the keeper, Peter Smith, whose quarters sat back in the sealed wing where the live specimens were kept. The keeper asked what the alarm had been. Wesker called. Scott started, then caught himself and said only to suit up and keep clear. He knew nothing more to give. Left with a half-said name, an alarm and a suit in his hands, the keeper drew the obvious conclusion. An accident of some kind, down in the basement lab, and for some reason Wesker is involved. That is what he wrote in his diary that night. Precaution, nothing to worry about. He put the suit on and did as he was told. He and a handful of others walked out that hour, and not all of them came out clean. The virus in the theatre and the man clearing them, and whether it took, came down to whether he'd kept his shots up, and plenty hadn't. The keeper hadn't. It went in under his borrowed suit, and no one, least of all him, had any way of knowing. Just after 8, the surgery ended. They finished it. Every stitch under a standing order, security on the door. They closed the host, stabilised it and lifted the finished T-002 back into its cryocapsule and sealed the lid. The most valuable object Umbrella had ever made was safe in its pod. The people who had made it were handled second. There was one place to put them. The cell. Down on Laboratory B3. Not a specimen pen, but a proper holding cell. A bed and a sink and a heavy door built to hold a person, but it couldn't simply be opened. The security protocols file carved the whole facility into tiers. The visual data room to Keith Irving, the deep clearances to a handful of consultant researchers, names like E. Smith and S. Ross. It put the cell behind a triple lock and a single rule. No viral use without a consultant researcher present. No one man held all of it. So Scott woke 2 more from their beds. S. Ross, one of the 3 names cleared for the cell, to bring the passcodes down, and Doug Boyd, the night man of the prison and sanitation division, who ran the place and slept 2 corridors off. Both came straight from sleep, hurrying. Neither stopped for a suit. Scott was in no state to think of it for them. They worked the triple lock between them. 4 dazed surgeons walked into the cell, told only that the protocol asked them to sit there quiet for a while. No one thought to tell them to keep their suits on. In the quiet, they took them off. They no longer needed the air to carry it. It was in them now. It came off them the way any sickness does, on breath and cough and the close heat of a small room. Ross and Boyd, barefaced at the glass, were near enough to take it before the door shut. The surgeons didn't know they were infected. Scott didn't know that a loose collar and a lapsed antibody course had just let the morning in through the gap. Ross and Boyd didn't know what they'd walked into. Everyone did exactly as told in a place built, so no one ever knew more than his own small piece. The surgeons hadn't passed it to one another in the theatre. That came later, in the cell, once the suits were off. But it was already loose in the men who'd done the moving, and now it left with them. Scott back to his rounds, Ross to his lab, Boyd to his bunk, each carrying a little of the morning into a building that had been told it was a drill. Spencer rang Birkin, and he was not worried. He had watched worse than this disappear. The example he reached for is one of the odder true footnotes in the whole story. A biotech firm called Biosyn had once field tested an unlicensed rabies vaccine on farm workers in Chile. No consent, real deaths, and walked away without a mark on the company name. And that, Spencer said, was out in the open. We are a quarter of a mile underground. I rather think we will be safe. He had the sums right. He had simply named the wrong danger. Biosyn never had stars on their case. In all of it, Scott forgot about John, who had been awake all night at the monitor, and when the surgery closed and the word came that had been nothing, exhaustion took him. He went to his room and slept, none the wiser. It kept him out of the air longer than most. By nightfall, the lab doors were sealed, the reports flowing upward, the labs running on under their own power. The Tyrant asleep in its capsule. 4 people shut in a cell, gone very quiet. Building told to suit up and carry on. From Umbrella side, a good day's work, the asset secured, the incident contained. From the inside, the lights were on, the exits locked. 44 people had woken in the Arklay compound that morning. 44 was still alive when the sun went down. The countdown had begun. Part 5. The Slow Rot. 71 days to X-Day, the 12th of May, 1998. For one more morning, the few who knew still called it a drill. Most never heard the word. They carried on as before and did not much care. The suit had been on since the day before, nobody wearing one, been told why. Scott's order had come down stripped of its reason. An accident downstairs, the surgeons resting under protocol, lab sealed, everyone else back to work. So the staff built the reason themselves and settled on the smallest one that fit. Spill in the basement, contained, nothing that would climb to the upper floors. 44 people were inside those walls that morning. The virus had already reached some of them, more than any of them knew. Most of them it had not touched yet. Breathed in off a sleeve or a shared handrail, it worked slowly. 10 days, give or take, from the catching to the turning. Faster in some, slower in others, depending on how much they had taken in. We know that because Peter Smith wrote it down. The keeper kept a diary, 1 line a day, and it lays the whole slide out in order. 10 days is a long time. Long enough to feel your body going wrong and put no name to it. Long enough for the well to sit and wait to learn which they were. It showed first in the medical room. The duty doctor's name was Alan Fisk. He was not a virologist. None of the medical team were. They had been kept on to treat staff. Fevers, cuts, the odd broken bone. Stress, depression, low moods, and making sure that staff actually looked after themselves. They had never once touched the virus work, and no one had ever told them it existed. By the 13th, Fisk had more coming through his door than a quiet week should bring. Not a flood, just more. Fevers, swollen glands, a rash on the back, and arms that no cream would touch. He named each symptom and treated it and sent them back to work. It was all he could do. The people who could have read a slide and told him what he was looking at was sealed a floor below him, behind a door he had no code for. Others knew what it was, above him and beyond the walls. None of them would ever tell him. It presents like flu, he told Grace Yo, the nurse who worked the queue beside him, holding a chart he could make nothing of. And it does not behave like flu, and I have nothing to give these people. Grace had nursed for 20 years and never seen it before. That is not flu, she said. The rash, the eyes, that is the kind of thing you read about and hope never to see, something like Ebola, or worse. So he kept the queue moving and his face straight and hounded out what he had, which was nothing. Grace was in that queue herself before the week was out. The nurse became a patient and Fisk had nothing to give her either. The keeper's own decline runs under all of it, 1 line a day, in the same flat hand. The 12th, an itch he scratches once and forgets. The dogs go unfed. The 13th, his back hot and swollen, the useless cream, back to his rounds. 14th, the skin breaking into blisters. And up at the kennels, unminded for 2 days, the latches give. The dogs go out through the wire and into the forest. It moved at a different speed in everybody. In the visual data room, a technician went from the rash to raw red eyes inside a day. In the dormitory, others burned for a week and swore it was flu. Scott went slowest of all. He carried more out of it than any man alive, and still he stayed on his feet, greyer each morning, shorter with his men, still blaming the bottle. One of his own men watched it happen. Vernon Calder said nothing, narrowed his eyes and he kept his distance. The cover story had a cost beyond the confusion. The 4 surgeons from the theatre had been shut in a cell on the morning of the leak, a precaution they were told, somewhere quiet to sit while the incident was dealt with. But nothing seemed to be wrong with them. The labs were sealed, the reports filed, the drill declared over. Then the word came down from Wesker, through Scott. Let them out. The panic was over. So after a few days, they were let out. But there was nothing to let them back to. They had been brought in for one job, the surgery. The surgery was done. So they were handed a new one. Wash this thing in the tank. Lock its vials. Wait. They asked the obvious question. The work was finished, so could they go home? The answer was a cover story, and a thin one. There was a problem with the helicopter. A delay. Soon. They carried it out with them. Whatever they had breathed in that theatre went out into the working compound, a handshake and a shared doorway at a time. It was not only the surgeons. Rosa Marchetti was one of the 2 cleaners taken on that year, and she worked the lab, and only the lab. She wiped the handrails, she polished the door handles, she cleared the bench tops the sick had leaned on. She cut it early, the way she was always going to, and then she spread it through the lab on the very surfaces she was paid to keep clean. She was among the first of the domestic staff to go. The cell behind them stood empty. Hazard suit discipline held in some hands and slipped in others. The keeper kept his on. Scott kept his on and made his men keep theirs, right up until the fever took his judgment with everything else. Others gave it up. A hazard suit is hot and blind and heavy. A frightened man talks himself into being the exception, and the men meant to enforce it were among the first the virus had found. The security team was rotting on its feet like everyone else. There was one order the security team never doubted. It had come down from Umbrella Command, short and plain. No one leaves. Sick as they were, the guards held to it, and more than one person put it to the test. On the 15th, a researcher named Sam Odell broke for the tree line by the service road. They shot him before he reached it. On the 16th, Daniel Prosser did the arithmetic the rest were refusing to do. He understood that an accident nobody walks away from is not an accident, and he ran. They shot him too. Theo Marsh tried on the 20th, through the forest on the far side of the grounds, same result. The files only ever recorded one of them. In truth, there were several, each on a different day, each certain his route was the clever one, each one wrong. So the quarantine held. That was the horror of the middle of May. The people were being kept in on purpose by other people inside who believed they were only doing their jobs. And it tells you something about the men above them, that the one order to reach Arklay that week was this one. Not help, not answers, just make sure no one gets out. Up top, the one man who might have called for help was getting no answer. John had run the research floor for years. Like everyone else, he had been fed the cover story, and like almost everyone else, he stayed well. He was up to date on his antivirals, of course he was. He was the chief of research and a careful man. While the compound sickened around him, the shots held and the virus never took him. It left him well in a dying house. He did what a chief research does in a crisis. He called Umbrella. He asked for instructions. He asked for help. Nothing useful came back. Not from Birkin, quarter a mile away under the city. Not from Wesker. Not from Spencer. The lines were not dead. That was the strange part. They worked. He would get a ring, sometimes a voice, an excuse, a promise to call back. Then the line would cut off mid-sentence and stay cut. Someone was listening to every word and letting none of it matter. John told himself it was a fault on the line. The truth was colder. An isolated outbreak, sealed inside a single compound, was not a disaster. To the men above him, it was data. The most valuable kind, and the kind you cannot fake. They were not going to send help. They were going to watch. For now, he did the only thing that kept him upright. He carried on. He kept the routine of the labs returning. He saw his people back at their posts, surgeons among them, and let himself believe the worst had passed. He ran his research facility as though it were still a research facility and not a sealed box filling slowly with the dead. With Birkin gone and no word coming back, the last voice able to say no was silent. Staff drilled for years in what it could not touch found no one left to enforce a rule. Before they split into what they became, they sorted themselves by where they were and by how sick they had grown. In the mansion, for the people who worked and slept up there, life stayed almost normal. Short tempers, longer rumours, the bed still made, meals still taken, and work of a kind still done. The labs and the guardhouse were where the sick drifted. A man who knew he had it did not want to be seen. He went where the crowds and the questions were not. And many simply vanished into the house. The mansion is enormous. It holds rooms most staff had never once set foot in. It is no great trick to shut a door in a place that size and wait for the world to end on the other side of it. Most of them just waited. The kept to their rooms and their routines and told themselves it would blow over, the way you wait out bad weather. For a great many of them, that was the whole of the outbreak. They were not at ground zero, they had not flooded the basement or run for the trees, they were frightened and confused, and they sat tight and kept away from the lab. But not everyone could sit still. With empty days to fill and no hand over them, the ones who could not began to split. Some of them counted. Gordon, the head chef, counted food. The week's delivery never came. That was the first thing that made Gordon suspicious. The vans ran like clockwork every week, and this week there was nothing. He got on the phone to the supplier and got excuses. A delay, a problem at the depot. Next week, surely. Gordon knew an excuse when he heard one. A sealed compound cannot restock, and no one was coming to restock this one. So he did the sum no one above him had bothered with, and locked the dry store. He put his assistant Eddie on the door of it and set the compound storeman, Len Faraday, to counting every tin and sack they had left. Faraday's tally was the first honest reckoning of how long 40-odd people could last on a ladder built for a week. It was not long. He would not live to see the bottom of it himself. It gets rationed or it gets robbed, he told the men who came to argue. The first real fight of the outbreak was not over a gun, it was over the ladder. 3 days in, a shove and a raised voice, and Eddie standing in the way of it. The clever ones had already worked out that in a sealed box, the man who holds the food outlasts the man who holds the door. Others organised the other way, into teams. Not every guard agreed with Scott. Some wanted no part of shooting colleagues who ran for the trees, and as Scott sickened and his grip slipped, a few broke from his line for good. They threw in with the researchers instead. Together, the steadier hands tried to hold a plan rather than a room. Pair up, keep to the upper floors, check at each other by the hour, and wait. That was the plan in the end. Keep your head down, keep the safe rooms safe, and wait for the doors to open. Because this was still a building you could move through, not the tomb it would look like from the outside. You held on, and sooner or later Umbrella would come. For a week, it half worked. It is the reason any of them lived at all. The groups that lasted learned to be disciplined and cautious, and that caution cost them the thing that had made them a group in the first place. Others, with no one left to say no, did the thing they had always wanted to do. Arklay had spent years hiring brilliant people and telling them what they could not touch. Now nobody was left to tell them. For a certain kind of mind, the collapse was not a horror at all, it was permission. Henry Sarton was a botanist. He had infected a plant under watch in the guardhouse, and for weeks it had done nothing. Now he was free to feed it as much as he liked. So he did, and it began to grow. Roland Kessler went the other way, and down. Kessler had decided the old caged spiders in the caves were more interesting alive and improved. He carried a fresh dose of the virus down into the dark to give to one of them. He did not come back up. Whatever he worked on there, he did not live to see it. The giving of the dose was the last thing Roland Kessler ever did. Others did not reach for meaning. They lost their grip and made a strange kind of peace with losing it. In the dormitory, a handful of the frightened talked themselves into an idea that the sickness was not an accident but a judgment, that Umbrella's sins had earned it, and the one clean thing left was to stop resisting. They stopped taking Fisk's useless cream. They stopped going to the posts. They sat up at night and spoke about the sickness as if it was something owed, almost something welcome. It was not a faith and it was not a plan. It was a few minds with nothing left to hold, reaching for the one story that made the horror mean something. Others broke the other way, into despair. The virus was not the only thing making people sick. There was another kind of sickness in the compound that week, and it spread without infecting anyone. Cabin fever. Some minds went before their bodies did, and on the 17th, one of them broke badly, and took the aqua ring down with him. His name was Marcus Draper. There was nothing in Draper's blood. His reason was simple and gone. He made for the aqua ring, the great water tank sunk in the basement, meaning to open it. A man working the level heard him coming before he saw him. His name was Curtis Hale. He kept saying the water would take it all. Hale told the others afterwards. That was as much sense as anyone got out of it. I knew what he meant to do, so I ran. Hale got clear, the others did not. The tank went. The level flooded to swimming depth in minutes. It took the rest of them down with it, Draper somewhere among them. No one saw him again, no one climbed down to look. But the man who ran carried the story up the stairs. That one account is the only reason anyone above ever knew what had happened below. After that, the Aqua Ring was unreachable. The first part of the estate, the living learned not to enter. It would not be the last. At the far end of the dormitory corridor in room 001, a man named Robert did the opposite of Draper. He shut his door and meant to keep it shut. He was not sick, and he meant to stay that way. Robert had worked out what the others had missed. The hoarders, the broken, the ones who bolted. The way through a place like this was not to fight for food or make peace with dying or run for the tree line. It was to disappear. Make no sound, open no door, let the horror pass over the top of him, and wait for rescue. Because someone would come. Someone always came. Umbrella would send men, the doors would open, and this would be the story he told later. He was wrong about that. No one was coming. The silence on John's phone upstairs was the whole of the proof, but Robert never heard that phone, and the hope kept him quiet, and quiet kept him alive. When they knocked, he did not answer. Of all of them, the man who did nothing but hide lasted longest. By the end of that week, the count had begun to move. The three shot trying to run, Sam Odell, Daniel Prosser, Theo Marsh, each on a different day, each by a different route. Marcus Draper and the three his flood took with him, and Roland Kessler in the caves. 8 of the 44 gone. Survivors left 36. For all of that, the estate was still a place you could walk through if you knew which doors to leave shut. The horror was real, but it was cornered. The flooded basement, the one guardhouse hall where Sargent's plants were spreading, the caves below. The living had learned the map of where not to go, and most of the 36 were still up in the mansion, still eating, still waiting on a rescue that felt overdue, but not yet impossible. Two things had got loose that week that would not be put back. The dogs were the first, already gone into the forest. Second was older than all of it. There was a man named Tobias Wren. By the middle of that week, he had lost everything a mind can lose and keep breathing. He went down. Past the labs to where the estate turns to old stone and cave. Down to the one thing at Arklay that had been kept there longer than any of them and could not die. To the staff. Lisa Trevor was a rumour they feared. Most had never seen her. None went down willingly. Wren went down willingly. Whatever was left of his reason had decided the thing in the dark deserved to be free more than Umbrella deserved to keep it. Or perhaps he only wanted company at the end. We will never know. He left no note. He struck the shackles off, and he did not come back up. And the oldest horror on the estate walked up out of the dark on its own feet for the first time in 30 years. And that is how she got out. Not a breach, not an accident, a broken man with a reason of his own and a key. And it was still only the middle of May. Part 6. The Turning. 65 days to X-Day, the 18th of May, 1998. The time the virus took was nearly up for the ones who had breathed the most of it. The surgery team, over the open host on the morning of the leak, had the least of anyone. The middle of May had been the slow rot, people getting sick and not knowing why. What came next was faster and worse. First, what turning actually meant for the people still alive to watch it. There is no clean death and no clean rising. People do not fall down and get back up as something else. Epsilon rots them while they are still alive to feel it. We know because the Keeper wrote it, one line a day. The itch, the blister, the skin breaking open, the fever burning the sense out of him by degrees. His body coming apart around a mind that was, for a while yet, still his own. And at the end of that, when there is more rot than man, the thing that is left does not lie down. It keeps walking, it is hungry, and it reaches for the nearest living body to feed. That is the zombie, a risen corpse, yes, but one that rotted the whole way there while it was still alive and never got the mercy of dying first. The first to go all the way over was Gregor Voss. Voss was a researcher who had spent years near the best of the work and never once been let into it. Somewhere in the sealed weeks of May, watching the place rot, he decided the body the virus deserved was his. He did not catch it off a handrail like the rest. He took a full charge of it from the stores and put the needle in his own arm. He thought he would rise into something the height of the thing in the tank, the most feared thing in the building, at last. He rose into the same shuffling hunger as everyone else, only faster, because no shared sleeve carries what a full syringe does. The man who worked alongside him, Colin Reeves, found what was left and understood what Voss had tried to become. Then the thing that had been Voss came for him, and Reeves ran, and the door he shut behind him was the first of many. Then the surgery's team ran out. Then the surgery team's time ran out. Dr. Aaron Vance went first. He had run the surgery the leak came from his hands, finishing the work Reston had designed, and he had been closest of anyone to the host when it opened, so he carried the most of it. He did not go quietly behind the locked door out of sight. He went over where he worked, in front of people who knew his name. A young researcher named Beth Calder moved to help him, the way you would a man having a fit. Hale, an older hand, caught her by the collar and hauled her back. "Don't touch him," he said. "Whatever that is now, it isn't Aaron. Get the door shut." They got the door shut. It was the only medicine left. Within the day, the rest of the team followed. Dr. Helena Reston, the visiting specialist the whole operation had been built around, and the two assistants flown in with her, all exposed together at the leak. All turning together now, loose among the living they had been walking freely among an hour before. The two guards who had opened the cell that morning, S. Ross and Doug Boyd, turned that same week. They had moved carriers without their suits, and it came for them early and close. Once the first of them had finished turning and got to its feet, the thing had what it had never had inside these walls: other bodies to reach. It stopped being something in the air and became something with hands. So the living learned what they were dealing with fast and at close range. Anyone who so much as looked ill became someone to back away from. The ones who were truly sick were, by then, too far gone to notice the room emptying around them. There was no reasoning with a turned man and no medicine for him. A week of Fisk's useless creams had settled that. It left two blunt ways to stop one: burn it, or put a bullet through the head. The standing rule was to burn them, because Umbrella had always known that dead could come back, and ash cannot rise. But the flamethrowers were kept in the lower levels, and the lower levels were no longer anyone's to walk into, and bullets were no better. Only the security team had guns, and security was scattered and dying and its weapons with it. Most of the staff had never held a weapon in their lives. When the dead came, they were simply helpless. There was a bitter irony in who understood the danger first. The scientist had lived inside the cover story for a fortnight, too close to it to call what it was. The security team had spent that same fortnight nowhere near the lab, and they read it faster. Men who knew nothing of the virus grasped the threat before the people who had created it. One of them went further than reading it. Mara Doyle had worn the security uniform, but she had broken from the patrol weeks before and thrown in with the survivors. When the argument in the mansion hall went round in circles, she was the one who moved. "There are throwers in the sub-level stores," she said. "If we can't burn them, we're just locking ourselves in with them, one room at a time." Someone said the sub-levels weren't safe.
That old Silas Kemp, the caretaker who kept the cabin past the graveyard, was the only one who ever went down there, and no one had seen him in days. Then no one's coming to do it for us, Mara said. Scott's dead. The new one, whatever his name, he isn't here to save anybody. Nobody is. That's the whole point. We help ourselves before help comes, or there won't be anyone else. That's the whole point. We help ourselves before help comes, or there won't be anyone left to help. She took a lamp and went down through the falls to where the estate turned into old stone and cave. She found the caretaker first, or what the dark had left of him, mangled on the cold stone. And then she heard the sound of the old man must have heard last of all, the slow drag and clang of chains coming closer in the black. Mara Doyle went looking for a flamethrower and met Lisa Trevor instead. Nobody upstairs ever knew. Two things had been loosed into that dark. The cage spiders were spreading through the caves, one already growing past the rest of the dose Kessler had died giving it. And the oldest thing on the estate, freed the night before by a broken man, now walked those tunnels on its own 2 feet for the first time in 30 years. Silas Kemp had gone down as he always did. He had not known the ground under him had changed. So the dead never burned. There is no ash in that house, no row of scorched bodies, nothing to say anyone even tried. Just locked doors, each one holding something that used to be a colleague. That was what the living could do in the end. They could not cure it and they could not burn it, so they put doors between themselves and it. They had no guns to fall back on, so they kept moving, giving up room after room and making safe zones of what was left. They went fast, and they left things where they lay. Reports, keycards, rations, medical sprays, box of ammunition for the lucky few with a gun to fire it. The place filled up behind them with everything they had dropped on the way out. By the 21st of May, the Keeper's diary ran out. The last line anyone can read is 2 words: itchy, tasty. That is where it stops. Not because he set the pen down, but because the man holding it was no longer in there. He had been one of the first carriers, and he had lasted a long time on his feet, minding his rounds. When he finished turning, still in his uniform, the man he reached first was Scott. Scott's replacement was not chosen by anyone inside. The order came from the estate, from the man Umbrella had running Arklay at distance that spring. Albert Wesker. And Wesker did not reach for a stranger. He reached for a man already working for him. Vernon Corliss had been Wesker's own eyes inside Arklay for months, the quiet line of report that still went out while every other phone in the building rang uselessly into the dark. Now Wesker pinned a rank on his mole and sent him over what was left of the patrol. Corliss would keep the estate shut, and he would keep Wesker informed, and he would not ask a single question he did not already know the answer to. By now, the lab under the mansion had stopped being a workplace. The researchers who turned where they stood, and below them, in the subject cells, were the ones the facility had never counted at all. Under the working floors were the cells, not for staff or subjects. People brought in off the streets and the margins, stripped and catalogued and kept for the work. 2 of them left nothing behind but a pair of x-rays and the names someone had written on them: Clark and Gale. When the lab fell, no one came down to feed them or contain them. They turned in their cells with nothing on, and they did not stay in their cells. They are the naked dead that wander the lab levels, no uniform, no name, because no one had given them either. The living understood there was nothing left to do down there, no one to save, nothing worth dying to fetch. So they sealed the way down and stopped going near it. From the 21st of May, the lab under the mansion belonged wholly to the dead. It was the first entire wing the survivors gave up for good. It would not be the last. The lab was not the only ground being lost. Across the courtyard stood the guardhouse, the old staff quarters, and it was falling in a different way. Henry Sarton had spent weeks feeding an infected plant and had done nothing. Now with the aquaring flooded in the level beneath it and no one left to stop him, it finally had everything it needed. It grew into the whole of the guardhouse hall, root and vine and a body of leaves the size of a room. Plant 42, the survivors came to call it, after the observation point where it had been raised. Umbrella's own file on it, the Plant 42 report, carries the date, the 21st of May, and a flat line of accounting. Several staff have already fallen victim. 2 of them had names. Priya and Hugo, caught in the hall when it came into full growth. The plant did not eat them the way the turned did. It took a hold and it drank, slow, and left the husks hanging in its own vines. It never left that hall. Its roots reached down into the flooded aqua ring beneath and drank from there, a monster fixed to one room, deadly only to whoever walked into it. And Plant 42 fouled the air with pollen. Where it settled, the insects it touched swelled. In the gallery above the hall, one of them stung a researcher named Nolan Ward to death. He did not rise. He bloated up purple and grotesque and stayed exactly where he fell. Another body the Count would have to hold. The swollen things kept the gallery after him, and it became a place no living thing crossed. So the circle closed. The plant held the hall, the wasps held the gallery, the drowned dark held the level below. The last safe corner of the guardhouse was the row of dormitory rooms, where a handful of the living still kept their doors shut. They did not know it yet, but the caves under them were filling with spiders, and their corner was shrinking too. By the time the worst of the turning had passed, the shape of the place had changed for good. Count the plainly dead first, the ones who would stay that way. From the security team, Scott, killed by the Keeper, and Mara Doyle, lost in the caves. From the wider staff, Priya and Hugo in the vines, and Nolan Ward stung to death in the gallery. Set those beside the 8 already gone in the slow rot, and the dead already ran into 13. Then the dead who would not stay dead. Gregor Voss, Aaron Vance and the surgery team, Reston and the 2 assistants, Ross and Boyd, the Keeper, and others who went over at their posts without anyone marking the hour, because by now no one was keeping the tally. These were not still corpses. They roamed the halls they had known in life, and a room with one in it became a room no living soul could cross. The estate held more walking dead and the living, around 24, pulled back into the mansion and the last of the guardhouse, up on the higher floors, holding the rooms that are still locked from the inside, half of them carrying it and not yet showing it, waiting on a rescue that the silence on John's phone had already answered. Survivors left 23. One of those locked doors was not like the others. Behind it, sealed in the crypt beneath the backyard cemetery, they had left Aaron Vance. They never managed to burn him. There was nothing left to burn him with. The containment had held all month. Not one soul had got off the estate alive, save the dogs that slipped the grounds back in May. And it had never once been meant to save them.
Part 7. The Man in the Sunglasses. 51 days to X-Day, the 1st of June 1998. The turning had torn through the facility and left it quiet. Not empty, quiet. The kind of quiet a place goes when the ones still in it have learned to move without sound. For 3 weeks the survivors had been trying to come up with a plan to stay alive. The phone still worked. That was the cruel part. Every call got the same runaround, excuses and dead exchanges and a promise of help that never came, until reaching a phone at all meant crossing ground that now had the dead in it. They had stopped expecting a convoy on the service road. They had stopped watching the trees for a helicopter. In the first days of June, someone finally came. He arrived without a name that anyone below him needed to know. A man in black tactical gear and dark glasses, indoors at night in a building where half the lights had failed. He did not ask how anyone was. He did not ask who had died. He walked the estate like a man taking an inventory, because that is exactly what he was. The staff who saw him remembered the glasses. One of them, a researcher named Martin Crackhorn, would set it down on paper before the week was out. His name was Albert Wesker. That spring, he had been monitoring Arklay from a distance. Now the distance had closed, and he had not come on his own account. For a month, the leak had been a private problem of the handful of men who caused it. That was over. Umbrella kept the whole arm of itself exactly this kind of mess, and it decided to treat the estate the way it treated any spill. Something to be sanitised and written off. Wesker was its hand on the ground. He did not walk in blind. The man who met him on the road already worked for him. Corliss had been his eyes inside for months, the one line still carrying word out while every other phone rang into nothing. They spoke in the dark corridor on the mansion's first floor with no one else in it. "How many still walking?" Wesker asked. 24 maybe. They've pulled up into the mansion and the guardhouse. They lock their doors at night. And the lines? Cut where they need to be cut. They think it's the outbreak. Some of them still leave messages on a dead exchange. Wesker nodded, the way he would at a chore already half done. "Keep it that way. Nothing goes out that I didn't send." Corliss held the corridor a moment past the order, then something in him gave. "It's getting too much now," he said. "It isn't just the sick ones anymore. There are things out there that were never people. Things down in the caves. I've done everything you've asked of me. I need you to pull me out." Wesker looked at him a moment. When he spoke, he was almost gentle. "You've done well," he said. "Hold a little longer. When this is finished, you leave with me. You have my word." Corliss believed him. A man standing in that much dark will take hold of anything that sounds like a way out. He went back to the gate. That was the whole of Umbrella's mercy. A man in glasses in a house of the dying, keeping his own asset in place with a promise he never meant to keep, making sure not one true word reached the outside. Wesker moved through the estate, keeping clear of the living and the dead alike. Crackhorn was one he could not avoid. He was a researcher who had breathed the same air as everyone else and drawn the same losing hand. By the start of June, the sickness was in him, and he knew exactly what it was. He wanted to phone his wife. Her name was Alma. He tried, and the line gave him nothing, and he tried again, and it was only when he understood for certain that no calls of his would ever leave the estate that he stopped reaching for the phone and reached for a pen instead. "My dearest Alma," he began. A man wearing sunglasses didn't permit any phone calls. He set the rest down as plainly as a lab report. An accident last month, the virus loose. Every infected colleague dead or dying. He knew what it did better than most, and he wrote that too, that it robbed its victims of their humanity and drove them to destroy any living thing, and that there was no cure. He had watched it take the others. He had decided he would not follow them. "Except to end my life," he wrote, "before I lose the only thing that separates me from them, my love for you." He dated it the 3rd of June. Then somewhere in the quiet of that day, Martin Crackhorn lay down and did not get up, and he died as himself. A man, not a thing that used to be one. That was the choice the outbreak left its last clear-headed people. Turn or go first. Crackhorn went first. Cutting the phones was the small part of what Wesker came to do. The rest was the mansion itself. Spencer had folded a trap into the walls of the place years back, and Wesker was one of the few alive who knew how to spring it. He set it to the worst of its settings, the director's cut. Working with Corliss and the last of the security team, he sealed the lab. The lift sank back under the fountain, the medals that drained it taken away, and the way down simply stopped existing. Then he turned the mansion in on itself. Doors locked, emblems pulled and hidden, keys lifted from their chains and scattered. Room by room, the corridors that left the survivors reached the courtyard closed against them. By the time he finished, the people still alive were not hiding in the mansion. They were sealed inside it. Cut off from the gardens, from the guardhouse, from the way out and the way down. The house they had run to for shelter was now the thing that would hold them until they died. 2 problems, 1 solution. The secrets stayed buried, and so did the people who carried them. Wesker carried a master key. Where the original keys had to go, scattered somewhere in all the panic, he did not know and did not need to. His own opened every door in the house. Up near the attic, moving room to room, he passed the thing that would have stopped anyone else cold. A skin. a whole molted length of it, pale and dry, coiled in the dark and far too big to have come off anything that belonged in a house. He didn't stop. He noted it the way he noted everything and moved on. Whatever had shed it somewhere in the walls, and it was not his to deal with tonight. Among the people he sealed in was John. The head of the whole site had come through the outbreak still on his feet. His antivirals had held where everyone else's ran out, so the sickness that emptied the estate had not yet touched him. He still believed help was coming. He was still working the phones, still leaving messages for people who had already counted him among the dead. He had not written his letter. That would come later, when the thing he had kept out of his blood finally got in and he understood what the silence had always meant. There was one thing left on the estate that Umbrella did not want buried. It wanted it kept. At the door where they had sealed Aaron Vance, back when the dead was still rising in May, something had changed. Vance had not stayed a shuffling corpse like the others. Some hours after he fell ill, his body had gone into a deeper quiet, and while he lay there, the virus went back to work. It tore the body down and built something else from the parts, faster, stronger, skinned and red and blindingly quick. Wesker did not let them destroy it. He sent Corliss and the rifle down instead, and the last researchers with the training to handle it were marched to that door at gunpoint and made to study the thing that had been their colleague. Not all of them needed the gun. Some of these men could not stop being scientists. The estate was a tomb, the dead were in the corridors, and still they kept their notebooks open. They watched the thing. They wrote down what it did in the same steady hand as ever. You could call it denial, you could call it duty, call it something and then broken, past mending. They took notes while it killed them. The notes read plainly enough: when the host loses consciousness, the body drops into a dormant state and the virus becomes active, and it rebuilds the whole of it into something new, more agile after the change and more aggressive. They headed the note with a code, VACT, and they gave the creature a name. 4 of our researchers died trying to feed it, the note says. We have decided to call its kind Crimson Heads. 4 of them sent down under the gun to keep the asset alive and watched, and it took them one after the other. And still the order was not to end it. Termination, the note says, was definitely not an option. To Umbrella, this was not one more disaster, it was a discovery. The dead had another gear, and that thing was that valuable does not get burned. So they did not destroy it. They put it into the cold instead, though even that does the thing no justice. They built it in an elaborate casket, suspended coffin to hold something that should not be alive, and carried what had been Aaron Vance down to the one patch of ground the estate kept for its worst things. They shut him into the vault beneath the cemetery, a monster in a box, waiting under the graves for someone to open it. Up in the guardhouse, the last safe corner was closing on its own. The worst of the mass turnings had passed. A handful of the living still held the row of dormitory rooms, doors locked, waiting it out. Everything below them was already lost. They thought the doors would be enough. They had forgotten, or had been breeding below the estate. Down past the courtyard waterfall, the caves under the estate had been filling with spiders and ticks since the labs fell. One of the spiders was already growing past the rest, fat on the dose of a dying man who gave it in May. They did not need a door. They worked their way up through the old tunnels and the gaps in the stone, into the rooms of people who had run out of higher ground. The ones who could run, ran, for whatever room still had a door that locked. The ones who could not were left where the dark found them. The guardhouse, the one building on the estate that had ever felt like somewhere to live, gave way room by room, until only a stubborn few doors still held against what was coming up through the floor. The circle that had been closing all through May finally shut. Wesker had one loose end left, and it still believed it was an asset. Corliss had done everything asked of him. He had kept the gate, he had kept the lie flowing out in Wesker's name, and when the house was turned into its cruelest shape, it was his hands on the locks and the keys set in the very trap he was standing in. When it was done, Wesker found him at his gate and kept his word. Corliss was leaving with him, in a fashion that was true. One round, close to the head. It made a line in a file honest that would otherwise have been a lie. Not 11 of the 12, all of them. The man who had sold the other 11 out did not outlive them by a month, and he did not spend his last moment afraid of anything. He had just been told he was safe. By the time the man in the glasses left, the shape of the end was set. Crack on by his own hand, the 4 who died feeding the crimson head, the handful the spiders reached into the guardhouse, and more besides, at their posts and behind locked doors, with no one left well enough to mark the hour. And the one still breathing had begun to face a second enemy, one the virus had nothing to do with. The weekly delivery had stopped weeks back. What food and clean water was left had already been locked down, rationed, fought over. Now sealed in with no road out and nothing coming, the healthy were doing the same grim arithmetic the sick had stopped needing to. A store cupboard only lasts so long. Thirst does not wait for a bite. Some of the people on this estate were never going to be killed by anything with teeth. They were simply going to run out. Around 15 people were still alive on the estate, fewer every day, sealed into a house that no longer let them out, by a company that had already crossed their names off. Survivors left, 15. Wesker took what Umbrella wanted and left the rest to rot. He had cut the last line out, secured the only things with any value left, and turned the walls themselves into a cage. The assets in the cemetery, the specimens in the cells, the data on the drives, people had never been on that list. The survivors thought the silence meant no one knew. It meant the opposite. Someone knew everything, and had decided the tidiest thing was to let the estate finish dying on its own. The betrayal was no longer a rumour on a dead phone line. It had worn a suit and walked their corridors and locked the doors on its way out, and the people who understood the most about what had been done to them were about to be buried deepest of all. Part 8. Sealed Below. 44 days to X-Day, the 8th of June, 1998. Wesker was gone. What he left behind was a house no one could leave. For a month, the dying had come from the inside. The virus, the turned, the things that had been colleagues. Now in June, a second kind of ending arrived, and it did not need teeth. 12 men had once worn the security patrol's uniform. They were the ones who had held the line through May. They shot the runners, they kept the lockdown, they knew the least about what was really downstairs, and they guarded it hardest of all. By June, there were not 12 of them left. In June, the rounds turned on those who kept walking them. A guard opened a cell he shouldn't have left shut, and did not come back. Another was cornered in a corridor he had walked 100 times by something wearing the face of the man he used to nod to. Third simply stopped answering his radio. One at a time, at the post they would not abandon, the 12 became none. When Umbrella's own people came to tally what was left, they set it down in a single flat line. Our security patrol team has been completely eradicated. No names, a unit crossed out. That line was exact. Even the ones who had sold the other 11 out was gone. Wesker had closed that account himself at the gate before he left. Not almost the whole unit, all of it, and only the man who pulled the trigger knew how completely. With the security team finished, the last thing keeping any order on the estate was finished with it. No one patrolled now, no one shot the runners. The doors stayed locked because Wesker had locked them, not because anyone stood guard. Umbrella did not come back for the people, it came back for what it could use. Its own men came in quietly through the heliport, the one door always kept for headquarters. Wesker had told them where the dead were and how to move around them, so they went in and out in the dark and barely had to fire a shot. Only once did something make them stop. High in a corridor, up near the ducts, they caught a shape that did not move like the shuffling dead. Something quicker, wrong-limbed, too many joints, fast. Gone before the torch could find it, they knew what it was. Down in the B levels, the lab had bred a batch of chimeras, human and insect spliced into one body, and kept them caged long after the experiment was finished. They were specimens that should have been destroyed years ago and never were.
When the labs fell, the cages fell with them, and the chimeras went straight for the air ducts and the high corners, exactly where a thing built like that would go. Umbrella's men knew better than to follow one up into the dark. They took the data worth taking and the samples worth keeping and left everything else where it lay. The real prize they never touched. The embryos worth the most had gone out on the first morning at the leak. The thing in the cryopod and the specimens in their cells the company meant to keep exactly where they were, sealed and waiting for a day still weeks off. June was only the tidying. Take the records, take what was portable, and leave the monsters locked in with the people. The lab beneath the fountain was sealed now, the way down gone. What it had become down there, no one would see for weeks. The clean white rooms were not clean anymore. Blood had dried black across the tiles the surgeons once kept spotless. Dust and filth settled over the benches, over the trays, over the machines that still hummed with no one to tend them. Duncan Reed had tended them once, the site engineer. He kept the generators turning, water moving, the cold rooms cold. He held the place together with a spanner long after the science stopped, right up until the sickness took him at his own workbench. After that, the machines ran on, untended, humming to no one. And through it all shuffled the men who had run the place, turned at the desks where they used to work, tracking their own rot up and down the corridors of a laboratory no one could reach. The cleverest people in the building, walking in circles, in the dark. Through all of it, one man was still alive in the labs. John had run the whole site, and now he had the run of what was left of it. The antivirals in the dispensary had kept the sickness out of him. The rest of the drugstores kept him upright in his own way, and he used them, sleeping through days at a stretch, dulling what isolation does to a man alone in a building full of the dead. When the food ran out, he ate the nutrient feed meant for the thing in the tank, the slurry brewed to keep a tyrant growing. In his clearer hours, he still worked. He kept notes. He watched TOO2's viral He watched TOO2's vitals tick over in its pod, the one patient left with a pulse. It was the only job he had, and he did it for no one. And in those clearer hours, he still believed someone was coming. That was the cruelty of holding out. The longer he stayed on his feet, the longer he believed the story he had been handed. The accident downstairs, the containment, the convoy on its way. He left messages on a deadline for men who had already written his name onto a list of the lost. Then in the last days of June, the thing he had kept out of his blood got in. His test came back positive, and with it came the understanding he had been spared for a month. The silence had never been a failure. The convoy had been delayed. No call had gone unheard. Help was never coming, because he had been running this place faithfully on a lie, and the plan had always ended with him on the inside of it. He did not pick up the phone again. He understood now that no one had ever been on the other end of it. He sat down instead at a terminal in a small room off the labs, and he wrote to the one person he still wanted to reach. Her name was Ada. She was already gone. She had walked out on the first morning at the leak without a word, and she was not coming back, and she never had meant to. John did not know that. He wrote to her the way you write to someone you are certain is still out there, somewhere, alive. My dearest Ada, he wrote, by the time you read this letter, I will no longer be the person you once knew. The results of my test came out positive. The rest he wrote as a set of instructions, because that was the shape his love took, a way out left for her. If she was the last one alive, she was to take the material from the visual data room, trip the self-destruct in the power room, get clear, and make the whole accident public. The head of the site, dying of the thing the site had built, spending his last clear hour trying to hand the truth to the one person he thought might carry it out past the trees. He left her a way in. The password was the most human thing in the whole document. His name and hers. He had set the terminal to open for the two of them together and coded a second key into an X-ray on the wall, a photograph of the inside of a person waiting there for her to read. And then the last of it.
If you run into me in my hideous form, I beg you to put me out of my misery. Thank you, Ada. John. He dated it the 8th of June. Ada never read a word of it. The letter sat on a desk in a sealed laboratory for 7 weeks, his name and hers still waiting at a login prompt for a woman who was already long gone. When it was finally read, it was read by strangers in body armor who had never known either of them. And John turned. The man who had run Arklay went into the dark with the rest of it. Sight carried on, without anyone left at its head, because the last person who still believed in it was gone. By June, the ones still living were coming apart. In a locked room on the mansion's upper floor, 2 of them sat in the dark and tried not to make a sound. Colin Reeves and Beth Calder had been researchers once. Now they were 2 people, rationing a single bottle of water between them, marking the hours by nothing at all. Something moved in the corridor outside, the slow drag of a foot that never quite lifted off the floor. They both went still until it passed. That's the 3rd time tonight, Reeves whispered. It's the same one. It keeps coming back to the door. It doesn't know the door's here, Beth said. It doesn't know anything. It just walks. Then why does it keep coming back? She had no answer for that. She had run out of answers for a lot of things. Someone's coming, Reeves said. They have to be. You don't just walk away from a place like this. The company can't afford to lose it. Somebody's on the road right now. I know it. He had been saying it for a week. Beth had stopped believing it days ago and stopped telling him so, because taking it from him felt like taking the last thing he had left. Sure, she said. Someone's coming. They sat in the dark and listened to the thing outside walk away and come back and walk away again. Sometimes they could swear it tried the door handle. Not every word left behind made sense. Up in the mansion library, one of them left a note, Eric, to a man named David. He asked, quite calmly, for a favour. He had lost a book somewhere near the guardhouse. On a night, he'd had a little too much to drink and he wanted it found. Not just any book. A book on the plants that grew wild on the estate. The green and red and blue herbs the staff had started brewing into remedies once Fisk's cabinet ran dry. There was real knowledge in it, the kind you only get by trying the plants yourself. It was important to him. A book. With the corridors filling with the dead and food running out, a grown man sat down and fretted in a steady, careful hand about a book he had misplaced. That is what the horror did to a mind before the virus ever touched the body. It reached for the one small ordinary thing it could still hold and held on past all reason, because the alternative was to look straight at what was happening. Both men were dead soon after. The note stayed on the shelf, still puzzlingly asking after a book that no longer mattered to anyone. And through everything, one thing walked the grounds that none of it touched. Lisa Trevor. She had been on the estate longer than the labs, longer than the company's worst work, longer than any name on any list. The virus emptying the mansion had been drawn 30 years before from what they had done to her. It could not do to her what it did to everyone else. She simply went on. Cabin, to cemetery, down into the old stone below, to the altar, carrying a face that was not hers, looking for a mother who had died before most of the dead were even born. By the middle of June, the estate held almost no one. The security team gone to the last man. The only loss the company would ever admit to. John, a dead man at his own terminal with a letter no one would read for weeks. And a handful still breathing, still sealed into a house with the dead in its corridors, rationing the last of the food, listening to the shuffling below, and waiting on a rescue that was never real. 6 people were still alive on the estate. The ones who had understood the most about what was done here were the ones it buried first. John, who ran the site, dead with the truth still sitting on a desk. The lab sealed under the water with the work and the dead both inside it. Everything that knew too much was underground now, or under lock, or under the fountain. What was left above were 6 people at the end of their strength. who had only ever been told the accident downstairs was under control, starving, sleepless, flinching at every sound in a house full of the things their colleagues had become. They would be the last to go, and they would go without ever being told what any of it had been for. Part 9. Deadly Silence. 30 days to X-Day. The 22nd of June, 1998. This is how the last of them went quiet. By late June, the dying had run out of drama. There were no more mass turns, no more running battles in the corridors. Almost everyone who could turn had turned. What was left was a handful of people who had somehow stayed themselves in a house that belonged to the dead. They fell into two kinds. Some had come apart. They had watched everyone they knew stand up wrong, and their minds had folded rather than look at it. And some were still clear enough to understand exactly where they were and exactly what was coming. Mind that still works can do arithmetic. It can count the minutes. It can hear the last of the food run out. It still feels ordinary hunger, the plain empty ache of a stomach, not the dead's blunt hunger for meat. It still feels thirst, and it feels terror. The clean, bright terror of a person who can watch a friend start to sweat and go grey and know, near enough to the hour, what happens next. Some of them decided not to wait for it. The company would later file that under madness. Several researchers took their own lives, the record says, as though it were a symptom of the disease. It was the opposite of a symptom. It was the last sane thing a lot of them ever did. Two of them were hiding in the dormitory. One was called Robert. He had gone to ground in one of the rooms when the worst of it began, meaning to sit still and outlast the whole thing. For weeks, it had almost worked. He was not alone. A man named Nathan had holed up with him. Between them, they had a locked door, a little water, and a self-defense gun, and they had spent days listening to the ones they used to work beside drag themselves along the corridor outside. The things out there did not knock. Then Robert started to sweat. They both knew what it was. They had seen it a dozen times by now. The grey coming up under the skin, the eyes going flat. There was no test to run and no doubt left to hide behind. Robert said it first, because Robert could still say things. "You know what I'm going to be soon," he said. "I don't want to be that. Not in front of you." Nathan told him to stop talking like that. Somebody was coming. They only had to hold out a little longer. "Nobody's coming," Robert said. "You know nobody's coming. Do this for me while I can still say thank you." For a long moment, Nathan said nothing. Then he asked Robert to look away. He would not let his friend stand up as one of them. He shot Robert while Robert was still Robert, and he carried him into the bathroom, out of sight, the way you cover a thing you cannot keep looking at. Then he sat down and wrote, in a steady hand, to a woman named Linda. He told her that he was sorry. He told her he would rather die a human being than live on as one of those things. He said what he could of goodbye. And he would not stand up as one of them either. He hanged himself before the door could decide it for him. Two men, bullet and a rope, both of them choosing to go out as people rather than turn into what the house was already full of. It did not work. Neither of them stayed dead. The virus was already in Robert, and it was in Nathan soon enough, and the thing it does not need a beating heart to begin. The bullet and the rope stopped two men. They did not stop what was wearing them. When that mansion was finally opened, weeks later, both of them were still in the dormitory, and both of them got up. Of all the dead that filled those rooms, this pair were among the only ones anyone could ever put a name to. Robert, who wanted to wait it out, and Nathan, who wanted to die a man. The last clear choice either of them made, and the house simply took it back. Not everyone had a friend or a plan.
One of them ran the wrong way. When the corridors filled, he went up instead of out, up a narrow stair, into the attic, under the beams. Maybe he thought nothing would follow him up there. Maybe down or simply worse. But something was already in the attic. A snake lived up there, and not an ordinary one. It had been on the estate before the outbreak, kept long and thick in the dark, and the virus had made it enormous. It filled the attic, end to end. This was Yawn's domain now. A frightened man climbed into one place he had left to run and found it waiting for him. He did not come down. What he left behind was handprints, marks on the wood, up under the beams, where someone had braced and scrabbled and tried to get clear of a thing faster than he was in the dark. Just the prints. That was all of him anyone ever found. He was not the only one who left a mark instead of a body. Somewhere on the estate, on the wall of a corridor, another man wrote a last message, not in ink. There was no ink and no time, and no one left to read it. He wrote it in his own blood, with his own hand, as the strength to hold that hand up went out of him. It was not a warning, it was not a name or a clue, it was 2 short lines. I can't breathe. Save me from this pain. That was all. A person dying using the only thing he had left to write with, and using it not to accuse anyone or explain anything, but only to ask for the pain to stop. The writing trails off where his hand did. He got that far, and no further. Downstairs, the machinery of the place had stopped keeping up. There is a room on the estate where the dead were meant to be dealt with, a morgue, and the ovens to go with it, and a man called Sigd Warwick who ran both. In the early weeks, Warwick had tried to do it properly, to carry the bodies down and burn them and keep count. That takes people, living people, organised, not yet too frightened to touch a corpse. By June, there was no one left to run it. The bodies stopped being carried down. They stayed where they dropped, in the corridors, and the labs, and the halls, and the ones that were meant to be burned sat unburned in the dark. Because everyone whose job it had been to burn them, Warwick first among them, was lying somewhere else. In one of the rooms, someone had left out a recipe, a formula, worked out and written down for a chemical strong enough to kill the great flowering thing that had rooted itself in the flooded basement. Someone had done the science, someone had meant to go and use it. The formula sat there untouched. Whoever wrote it never made it back to try. The last of the clear ones did not go all at once. Colin Reeves and Beth Calder had held the bedroom on the mansion's 2nd floor longer than most. They had rationed a single bottle of water between them and marked the hours by the dragging of a foot outside the door. Reeves had spent all of it certain that someone was coming. Beth had stopped believing it days before, and had let Tim believe it because it was the last thing he had. On the night the water ran out, she finally said it. "No one's coming, Colin," she said. "There's no one left to come. I think you've known that longer than I have." Reeves was quiet for a while. "If I say it out loud," he said, "then it's just true." "It's been true for weeks," Beth said. "We just kept it in here with us." He nodded in the dark. He did not argue. That was the worst of it, she thought, in the little time she had left to think about anything at all, not the fear. The moment he stopped arguing. There was no convoy. There was only the house, and the dead in it, and 2 people who had finally run out of reasons to sit still. The last few who could still stand broke out what weapons they had. It was not much. It had been more. There had been 2 shotguns on the estate. One had broken and stayed broken. The other, the one that still worked, the one a man named Warren had carried through the worst of May, had gone missing. So had the heavy revolver the Colt Python kept back for emergencies. Both of them had simply stopped being where they were kept at some point after the man in the sunglasses came through. No one had time to wonder why. They only knew that when they reached for the good weapons were gone, and what was left was a broken gun or whatever rounds a person could carry. So they armed themselves with what there was, and they tried to move, to fight a way out through the halls that had no way out. Moving in the dark, chased, dying, one by one, they dropped things, a magazine here, a box of rounds there, kit let go mid-stride by people who could not stop to pick it up. One by one, the writing stopped. The notes end. The diaries end. There is a last date, and then nothing, because there was no one left to make a mark. By the close of June, the estate held no one who could still call themselves alive. Survivors left, 0. The clock the whole story had been counting reached the bottom, and nothing happened. You expect the end of a thing like this to be loud. It was the opposite. When the last of the 44 was gone, the estate did not erupt. It went quiet. A great house and its laboratories, built to make the most dangerous things on Earth, standing in the forest in complete silence, full of the dead and empty of the living. Almost empty. 3 weeks passed like that. 3 weeks of a sight that did not answer. In a room with a long table and no windows, far from the forest, the people who owned Arklay finally admitted what the silence meant. No reports, no calls returned. The weekly figures simply gone. Their own security had stopped answering a month before. Every line into the estate ran into the same nothing. They did not send help. They had never meant to. They had watched an outbreak run its whole course inside a sealed estate from the safe distance of the numbers. And now they had fallen silent, they turned to the only question they had ever really had about the place. Not how to save it, how to use it. The house had been made ready for them weeks before, and the man who made it ready was already dead. Vernon Corliss had been security, the chief of security after Scott, then Wesker's man over all of it. Before Wesker left in June, he had Corliss do one last job. Turn the house back into a trap. The estate had been built as a puzzle box. A maze, locked doors and hidden keys and crests lifted off walls. A mansion that made you earn every room. Wesker set it to the worst of its settings and had Corliss lay the course. Key items moved into place. Keys scattered back through the rooms to be found in order. The good weapons taken out of reach. The working shotgun and the heavy revolver and a broken gun left where a working one should be. And, on a standing order kept in a crumpled memo, one small key hidden in the collar of a guard dog and the animal left out on the west terrace. A key on a Doberman waiting in the grounds for people who did not yet know they were coming. When it was done, the house was ready, and the man who had set it was of no more use to anyone. Wesker had promised him a seat on the helicopter. He kept that promise weeks back at the gate with a single round. The file that called the secret security patrol team completely eradicated was, by the time anyone read it, simply true. The last of the 12, the one who thought he had bought his way clear, went before the 11 he had betrayed, not after. So the trap sat, sprung and ready for people who did not yet know they were coming. Which leaves the last question, and the largest one. Why let it burn? Arklay was the crown of the whole enterprise, the tyrant, the years, the money, the finest laboratory the company had. Why would the man at the very top set a match to all of it and call it an accident? Because to Spencer, none of it had ever been the point. By the summer of 1998, that one thing was already secured. The successors existed. Project W was safe and growing, far from the forest. And of course, Ark. So Arklay was expendable. It had done its work. It had made the money, built the monsters, and pulled the whole world's suspicion onto itself, and now it could carry that suspicion into the ground and leave the real project untouched, unwatched, unsuspected. Spencer let his crown jewel burn because the crown jewel had never been the point. The 44 died believing they worked at the most important place on Earth. They died for a man who had already crossed their sight off his list, and who was not even watching the clock as it ran down. He was looking somewhere else. Children who would outlive them all.
So at 13 minutes past 2 in the morning on the 22nd of July, the order went out. It named the day. On paper, it was one of a run of ordinary orders. Everyone who mattered knew this one was not. Later, it would have a name of its own. X-Day. The site would be used one last time as the thing he had always been. An experiment. The unit that had been circling Umbrella's business would be steered off the road into the forest and up to the door of a mansion that had stood silent for a month. Once they were inside, every creature the estate still held became a question with a datasheet behind it. How does the Tyrant perform against trained soldiers? How do the hunters hunt? What holds them? What stops them? How long they last? The dead staff of Arklay had been the incubator. S.T.A.R.S would be the field trial.